Hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. Welcome to Taylor Wessing's International Employment Webinar, Back to Work, the New Future of Workplaces. We should have probably put a question mark in this title because it's not clear to me that we will be returning back to work. Even if we go back to our offices or our factories, will it be the same as it was before? And there's a big question about whether we go back at all. In the UK, we're not sure when my firm will be back in our office. We've been out now for 10 or 11 weeks, but my colleagues on the webinar are able, most of them, to go to their offices. And I hope to learn from some of their countries about what the near future looks like, as well as discussing a little bit the medium-term future for how work will change and how employees want to work when this corona stuff is over. We have people from 6 countries talking with us today. At the end of the slides, you will see their contact details, but they include my colleague Brigitte from Austria, Tiffaine from our Paris office, Rose from our Netherlands offices, Michael Pils from our German offices, Aksa Sadiq Khan from our Dubai office, and Helen Farr, also from London. I'm going to show you now the agenda that we're going to cover. So we'll look at the key questions, we'll look at the different regional and national attitudes to coronavirus and the phased return. And as I say, we want to learn a little bit from Austria and Germany, who are ahead of some countries. And we're going to talk about the steps you need to reorganize the workplace, both in offices and factories, but also working from home in the future and now. It's important to consider the rights of participation from workers, which vary across the countries. And it's very important to think about how to avoid problems and disputes, because we're already seeing a high number of disputes as people work from home, a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of potential problems around health and safety and employee communication, and also discrimination. So we'd like to talk a little bit about how you reduce the risk of those. And in doing that, we want to talk about some key questions, and we gathered these from some of the audience to this webinar before we wrote our slides. And these seem to be some of the key things that are on the minds of employers around the world. What do we need to do now in formal workplaces and where people are working from home? Can we make people return to the old workplace? Or on the opposite side, can you make people stay away? We've got some people, especially younger colleagues, who really want to return to work for the social aspects and for some of the amenities and benefits of the workplace. But in some countries, it's very hard to allow that at the moment. And we've got a bunch of questions around the medicalization of the workplace. Will your landlord insist on temperature testing or even medical testing for return to work? Do you want to do that? Can you collect data on symptoms, and can you share them with workers so as to manage health? And what about people who may need to stay at home because they have health conditions or they are vulnerable people? They have discrimination rights that you need to factor into your plans. The last 2 questions that we want to bear in mind are quite big ones. What's this going to do to the balance between the absolute responsibility of employers for the health of their colleagues and workers against the need to take account of individual circumstances and wishes? For example, today at Taylor Wessing in London, we began a survey of our colleagues asking them, what's your attitude to returning to work? When do you think you will feel safe about it? What do you think we need to do to help you return to work? And if you feel you can't return to work, what do we need to do to support you working from somewhere else? So there's a really interesting question there as to what that does to the relationships we have with our colleagues long term. I'm an old partner. In the old days, I was never asked by my colleagues what I wanted. I was just told to do it. And now we seem to be changing to an environment where we're very much taking account of what our colleagues want and giving them some influence and some decision making in our business. And I'd be very interested in what that means for the future organization of work in terms of dialogue and participation, as well as the physical organization of work. So in our webinar today, we're going to ask some of those questions and seek to answer them. And I very much encourage you to raise any question you have through the dialogue box. There's a Q&A box on your screens. Ask it whenever you want to, and we will try to answer it whenever you ask it, even if it doesn't seem to fit the slides. So with that strong encouragement to raise questions from the audience, can I now pass over to Michael Pils, who's going to talk about the current crossroads in Germany.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean. And indeed, what we have seen in the crisis is that our current working atmosphere or working environment is dramatically changing. And this slide is focusing on, let's say, 5 areas in a very brief summary where we can see enormous changings which have taken place quite recently. So let's talk about health and safety, for instance. In the pre-corona phases, of course, this was quite important, but it was not on a, let's say, number one question of employers asking lawyers about health and safety aspects. Nowadays, this is a completely hot topic, of course, and we have to update our emergency plans. We have to set up new regulations, new instructions for employees, training of employees. How to deal with Corona in those times is very, very important. And of course, we have a lot of strong new regulations in that area. So this is something we will see that this will infect our daily business in a very, very broad way, and in the near future is definitely focusing on health and safety aspects in deep ways. So next, of course, work from home. Home office. Before Corona, it was quite strange to work from home, but nowadays we have to deal with the crisis, and we have to work from home. So this is definitely, we will see that our future work will be dominated in certain ways from home office and from work from home. Short-time work and reorganizations. Before Corona, of course, there was some indications that due to the general global change of the economy, there will be some reorganizations. But now it is very clear that we will have to focus on such topics too. And as mentioned before, upcoming legislation, we see that the German legislature, but the international legislatures, they are so active due to Corona, so we have to deal with a variety of new legal regulations. And this is, of course, very complex for companies, especially in Germany, if you think that we have 16 federal states, and each state, even each city, has its own regulations to comply with. So this is just a general framework. We see there are challenges, but there are also opportunities, and we will see that our future work is dramatically changing through coronavirus. This is the fast view from Germany, and I'm very happy to hand over to my colleague.
Okay, so Brigitte, Austria is easily 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks ahead of the UK in the relaxation of public space and the return to work. What's your experience?
Yes, thank you, Sean. Actually, as you have already mentioned, and all of you already have heard, I'm sure, there are step-by-step opening measures implemented and also expected within the next weeks and months. So yesterday it was, for example, announced that as of today, people from all neighboring countries will be able to enter Austria freely as before the coronavirus pandemic. The only exception at the moment is Italy. I mean, there are quite a lot of discussions, and it will change in the future. But at the moment, the neighboring countries are opened. Hotels, guest houses, and camping sites, for example, are allowed to open again since Friday, 29th of May. A mouth and nose protector must be worn throughout the entrance and reception area. This restriction in this area. However, fitness and yoga studios can now also open again. As regards sports in general, a 2-meter distance applies, and equipment must be disinfected more often. Events will again be permitted as of 1st July in closed rooms for up to 250 people and in open air areas for up to 500 people. And as of 1st August, this will be increased again to 500 people in rooms and 750 people in open air areas. And wider opening will be possible if there is individual authorization given. Actually, private events are not restricted, and the government appeals to the common sense of the people in this respect. As regards business premises, entering the customer area is permitted if a distance of at least 1 meter is kept, and customers as well as employees wear a mechanical detective device covering the mouth and the nose area, unless there is another suitable protective device in place between the persons for spatial protection. The number of customers is restricted so that 10 square meters must be available per customer. If the customer area is smaller, then only one customer at a time may enter the premises at the moment. However, we are expecting further reopening measures as of 15th June. At the place of professional activity, a distance of at least 1 meter must be maintained, unless the risk of infection can be minimized by suitable protective measures. The obligation to wear a mechanical protective device in areas where it is not already mandatory under under other legal provisions, then it's only permissible by agreement between employer and employee. So the working place is not so strictly regulated and was also not in the past. So that work in the office was possible, however, of course, with the restrictions.
So, Brigitte, let me ask you, does this mean that employers are not changing buildings, not redesigning offices, not putting up glass screens? Or are they? They
are actually doing this, and I will come back to this later on again regarding the practical measures, especially from so according to the opinion of occupational medicine experts. They recommend quite a lot of measures in this respect, and I will explain this also later on.
All right.
Yeah.
Let me. We'll come on to a question which has come onto the screen. I'll mention it now so that everybody knows it's coming. We will cover with yourself and Rose the question about what kind of employee consultation is needed in Germany or elsewhere about returning to work or staying at home. But let me just ask you about one point in your slide before we go on to Helen, where you say employers mainly decide themselves autonomously what safety measures are to be implemented. What does that mean? Does it mean that Austria is very laissez-faire and there's not strict rules from the government? Because that seems to contrast with England.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, the regulation is to keep the distance and or to introduce some other protective measures. But in the end, official orders, such as, for example, quarantine, are usually only ordered for corona-infected persons or for those persons who had first contact with an infected person. Any other person, especially in the same household, is usually not covered by such an official order, for example. So in the end, the employer has to decide himself whether or not it is acceptable for him to let such person work in the operation or in the office, and that then under what conditions. So I will also come back to this, what undertakings have implemented our task force in this respect. But I will tell a bit more later.
Right. I mean, that does sound to me like a contrast with the UK. When we did a webinar on this topic 2 months ago, it was very different. Then I was horrified to hear about how France was in lockdown and Germany was had short-term work across the country, and in the UK we seemed to be doing nothing. There's a big change in that last 2 months. Helen, do you want to talk about some of those issues?
Thanks, Sean. I think that's absolutely right. I think the position in the UK reflects the fact that we are somewhat behind some of our colleagues in mainland Europe. What we're seeing now in the UK is a very gradual start to reopening of businesses. There was a small sort of phased reopening that started in the middle of May, whereby the government did give guidance that only a small number of businesses, so those that were viewed to be essential and where people absolutely couldn't really do those roles working at home, could go back to work, provided obviously certain requirements were met. And so the sectors that are starting to reopen in the UK now are all continuing to open: food production, logistics, construction, manufacturing and distribution. But the government guidance is very much that people should avoid public transport if at all possible, that we should retain the social distancing measures, which in the UK, interestingly, we have a 2 metre distancing rather than the 1 metre, which seems to be in other countries. There's a suggestion that people should wear face covering in enclosed spaces and aerosol to avoid aerosol transmission. But because of sort of shortages in PPE in the UK, interestingly, the government hasn't gone so far as to say it's mandatory, but certainly for some roles, it would be important that people do wear face covering, and people are taking their own decisions on that and just unilaterally buying them or providing them. And what we have in the UK was a clear sort of set of guidelines, which the government called the COVID-19 Return to Work Guidelines, and they apply to 8 workplace settings. And they set out 5 main steps that would apply to each of those workplace settings, that start with this expectation that any employer will undertake a COVID-19 risk assessment. Building on Michael's points, I think in the UK, as with all of our countries, what we're seeing is that this focus on health and safety is key. The second key point is to make sure that employers try to enforce this 2 metre distancing as much as possible, that businesses, if that's not possible, take steps to manage the transmission and reinforce cleaning steps. Mm-hmm. And that links into this slide, which is that the obligation in the UK is absolutely to undertake a risk assessment, and that is a key focus behind the return to work plan. The expectation is that absolutely the result of that the assessment should be shared with staff. But more than that, there should also be an obligation to consult with staff about it, and we're going to come on to look at some of those consultation obligations. I think the key message really with the risk assessment is that clearly things are going to change. There's guidance will develop depending on how the pandemic develops, and so businesses need to remain alert to those changes, but they have to be innovative in their response and flexible. And so I think that it's obviously very much a question for employees to sort of be alert and to ensure that their risk assessment is fit for purpose. The other point just to make with the risk assessment is that if you have more than 50 employees within your organisation, once you've agreed it, you are expected to put it on your business's website in the UK. And there's some debate about what exactly you would put on there, whether you put the full risk assessment or just an abbreviated form.
Helen, let me ask you about that. We're going to skip through the slides to talk about consultation in a moment, and I'll bring in Rose and Tiffany and Brigitte. But about this, it's not a law in the UK that you must publish your risk assessment. You must talk to your own staff about it, but you don't have to publish it online. Why would anybody do that? Isn't it just an invitation to get sued by someone?
Well, I think, I would agree with you. Certainly the reason for the concern is that the government's guidance, there's clear reference in the most recent set of guidance that there's this expectation that employers would do that. the legal obligation, as you're right, stems from the Health and Safety at Work Act, and that includes the obligation to consult about this risk assessment, as you should do with any other. So there is a mandatory sort of expectation for consultation. And I think because of that, that's why some businesses are concerned, because the government in the UK is increasing, as we'll come on to look at, the budget for the Health and Safety Executive, which is the body that will be enforcing the compliance. And I think the practical reason for potentially publishing the risk assessment, or at least an abbreviated form, is that without it, I'm pretty sure someone from the Health and Safety Executive would be getting in touch and saying, well, what steps have you taken? There is also a suggestion that you put a poster up in your workplace as well that's visible to all workers and visitors, again, just to show that you've complied with the COVID-19 requirement.
Right. So I guess the point there is that although it's not strictly legally required, we know that across Europe, the health and safety and labour inspectors are being given more resources to intervene and to audit, and that might be one way to reduce your exposure to audit. I suppose the other point is the last one on the slide on the screen now, that there is the court of public opinion, and that's a tougher court than law courts in lots of ways. And I guess these measures are intended to help build public confidence and to make businesses answerable to the consumer as much as to their worker, even if the law doesn't require it.
I think you're right. I think it just gives that sense that you've thought about it and that you've properly considered the issues, and it should give people a sense of comfort when they come to your workplace. Right.
We talked about employee consultation, and there was that question mentioned earlier on. I'm going to shoot through some slides now to enable Rose to lead us on the answer to that, the requirements for employee consultation. And the question is, what about this consultation obligation? Is it only about returning to work plans, but is it also about staying at home or redesigning your workplace? Rose, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks. When going back to work, a lot of questions arise and discussions regarding working conditions, working time, obviously, but also with regard to holiday schemes or home working policies, monitoring the workplace, or processing personal data if you work from home. Those are typical examples where the Works Council need to be involved when there's a decision to change a policy or something collective at least. And also if there's a change in the in such policy regarding working conditions at the office. So that's something where in the Netherlands the Works Council, if you have one, need to be involved, and they need to be asked for their consent on your intended decision. It's very important to do this on time and actually to just involve them and get a sense of what's going on and the issues staff might have on these specific topics. The Works Council need to be involved, and the sooner you have them involved, the easier the decision-making process could be in these cases.
How about from France, Tiffaine, and anywhere else? What are the consultation rules about staying at home or returning to work?
Yes. So in France, the Works Council needs to be informed and consulted on several topics, actually. So on the one hand, on the risk assessment in the company and the update of the legal risk assessment document. So to answer your question, this risk assessment should include all measures of adaptation of the working place, so everything which relates to return to work, but also all the risks that could be linked, for example, to home working, and also psychosocial risks, for example, the risk to do a depression at home, to be thorough. And the Works Council also needs to be informed and consulted on the implementation of the necessary prevention measures in the company. It's important that this information and consultation takes place prior to the implementation of the measures in the company, in order to be able to have a constructive dialogue with the employee representatives. So what happens if you don't in France? If you don't, you may face a decision like the one rendered against Amazon in France. So the French judges considered that Amazon France did not sufficiently involve its employee representatives in the assessment of risks linked to COVID-19, and in particular in the assessment of the psychosocial risks. And as a consequence, Amazon was ordered to restrict its activity to orders for essential goods only, so to suspend all its other activities as long as the information and consultation was not properly made, and subject to a fine of 100,000 euros for each receipt, preparation, or dispatch of unauthorized products. So,
Amazon distribute a lot of products. That would be quite a big fine.
Yeah. So that could be quite a big fine. So I would recommend in France, we always have the same scenario, which means that the legal action is initiated by unions or employee representatives when they consider that they were not sufficiently involved. So they just should be involved, and it's important to encourage an open dialogue.
All right. Does anybody have a fixed time period? If I'm planning to return to the office on 1 September, is there a fixed time period before that I must notify employees or representatives? Or is it more a question of what's reasonable? Michael?
First of all, it's a question of what is reasonable in this respect. Of course, depending on what kind of reorganization is connected with returning to work, there are certain periods to be respected. For instance, if you need to relocate an employee, so to assign an employee new jobs, or if you have some new plannings with regards to personnel stuff. So that's of course there you have to take in mind those time frames. But as mentioned before, co-determination rights of Works Council is a very, very crucial issue, and you need to comply at a very early stage. So if you want to start in September, then you should maybe consult with the Works Council in advance in order to set up the emergency plans and the working conditions adequately, as discussed by your colleagues. So that's from a German perspective. There's a certain time pressure.
All right. I'm going to mention another question that's come in, which is whether there is any centralized government guidance for how to manage a return to work or working from home. And what I will say is that at the back of the slides on our screen, which we'll get to in about 20 minutes, there is a list of Taylor Wessing resources there, which include return to work checklists in the Netherlands and Germany, and also from the UK perspective, some of our guidance, which has links to the central government COVID website. It is possible in the UK and also I think in other European countries to sign up to automatic updates. You don't only have to get them from Taylor Wessing, and there are other law firms available. The UK government, for example, has an ability to sign up to updates when they come out for employers. Be careful when you sign up to the updates that you tick the right box, because I signed up to be updated in all media, text and email, and on any issues, and I thought that meant I would get anything to do with employment. It means I'm getting things about repatriating holidaymakers from Chile, the death industry, primary education. So in some respects, at least in the UK, too much information, and be careful what you sign up to from central government. But we will have those links for you. So let me just go back into the slides now, and we talked a lot about the principles on reorganizing the workplace. The slide in front of you just very quickly highlights some of the common provisions that are being recommended. It comes from the UK, and hence you'll see the 2-meter reference there in the UK. British people, of course, it's very well known how cold we are and distant. So it's maybe no surprise that our social distancing is twice as much as the French and other continental Europeans. And of course, after December, our social distancing will increase when we have Brexit. But most of these other measures, I think, will be very common to consider across the European Union. And bear in mind the special guidance that if you're in a multi-occupancy building, that you don't own yourself or control yourself, you don't only have to talk to your employees, but you will also need to talk with your landlord, and the landlord's going to insist on finding a solution that results in some common approaches between the tenants, because the landlord is not going to want to be liable for one tenant's activity creating cross-infection with other tenants. So there are more than 2 people in this conversation about the plans to return to work. Your landlord will also have a kind of informal regulatory role alongside the labour authorities and health authorities. Let's look a little bit, I don't know if it's to the future or the past as to what Dubai is doing on workplace reorganisations with AXA. In some ways, it sounds more authoritarian, I think, than even the UK. And then we'll go on to talk a little bit about working from home. So, AXA.
Thank you, Sean. So just in relation to Dubai, initially, right from the beginning, we were told that the majority of the employees should start working from home, and the office capacity will be limited to a 30% percentage, and also the visitors' capacity will be the same. There was an exemption for certain sectors which could operate fully, such as the food and health, pharmaceutical, medical industries. As of the 26th of May, there was an announcement made which said that office and visitors' capacity will be increased to 50%. And as of yesterday, offices and visitors' capacity can now be at 100%. In terms of the clients that we have been speaking to and what we've seen in the market, it seems unlikely that a lot of the employers would say everybody should go back to work fully at 100%, at least not within the next few weeks or so, because many companies will need to put in place certain protective measures before they could have a full office of all the employees. So this would include having mandatory temperature checks through certain devices, whether it's a thermal system or you just have a handheld way to temperature device. And certainly in our building, that's been happening for a while now, even when the capacity was at 30%. And this will be a very important factor before people could actually return to work to ensure that this is happening. And in addition, you will have to wear mandatory masks whilst you're in the office. There will be a 2-meter social distancing rule as well. And you will have a duty to report any suspected cases of COVID-19 or employees that are maybe having symptoms of it to the health authorities. So there's a lot to think about before we can have people return to work. And the working from home aspect is actually quite a noble one in the UAE. But post COVID-19, I think things are going to change, and many employers are already looking at how they can enhance working from home facilities for their employees as well. So this is where we are at the moment.
And let me just make sure I captured it, because 20 minutes was a long time ago, and you mentioned temperature testing on coming into an office. Can you just give me what the practice is or what the legal requirement is in Dubai to be allowed to go into work on that front?
They have to, basically each building, it's mandatory and it's a legal requirement that as a visitor or an employee enters the building of any office, there's a security person at the gate who will check your temperature. And you, generally speaking, if it's above 37.5, they will refuse entry to you. And then subsequently, you'll go up to your relevant officer's floor and you'll be checked again a second time, just to double check that your temperature is still the same. And you will not be allowed in unless your temperature is below 37.5.
Wow. So I'm a menopausal woman having a hot flush, and I won't be allowed into the office just because my temperature is too high.
Yes. So it's a very strict
or I'm a fat guy who's run from home and is still too hot. Okay. So
they'll probably tell you to go back and come back in again.
Take a nice bath. Tiffaine, could that work in France, or is it? I'm guessing. How would that work in France?
In France, it's a little bit the opposite. So the temperature testing is not recommended at all by the French government and by the French Data Protection Authority. So it's not prohibited as such, but if the employer decides to do it despite this governmental recommendation, he has to know that it cannot be imposed upon employees, which means that employees could refuse to do the temperature testing. And, for example, if their temperature is too high, they could also refuse to go back home, or if they are asked to go back home, they will need to continue being paid. And what is absolutely prohibited is that the employer collects any data in this framework. So the employer can do the temperature checking without being able to impose it upon employees, and he should not keep any record from this temperature testing. Regarding everything, what we often have questions regarding, for example, checks, so a question relating to health or personal life in order to know whether the employee is feeling well or not, who he did meet, where he did travel, etc. All these kind of questions or questionnaires are prohibited in France because it is considered that these questions relate to medical secrecy and should not be raised by employers in France. So the only thing that an employer can do, of course, on top of prevention measures in the office, is to encourage employees to take a medical appointment if they have any symptoms, if they have been in contact with somebody who has symptoms.
But they can't control it. So how about if they try to use social pressure to make employees comply? So you can't insist and you can't fire them and you can't keep their pay. But is it possible to try to generate social pressure to reduce resistance from employees? For example, if you discuss it with the Works Council and the representatives agree that it's a good idea, can that be used?
Yeah, there could be some social pressure because everybody knows that it's important to preserve the other's safety and security. But really, all questions relating to health or all temperature testing are absolutely not recommended by all authorities, and the Works Council would know about that. So the social pressure, I would say, should more be used in order to ensure that employees go back home or do not go to the office if they are feeling unwell.
Right. Let's just keep on a little bit longer because I've got a couple of questions again on the screen about this dialogue and social pressure and consultation. This is aimed at Helen, I think, mainly in the UK. If you don't have a Works Council or any trade union or standing employee representatives, is it necessary to consult with employees about the return to work or returning from home?
Thanks, Sean. The position in the UK is that what you have to do is you have to consult with employees about the COVID-19 risk assessments. And it's a question that we've been asked because a lot of our clients don't have, elected representatives already in place for that purpose. So what people are doing is they are starting the process of sort of trying to elect reps remotely, or at the very least having a dialogue with their employees. I think so. That's the sort of practical way in which people are managing it in the UK. I think there's then a separate question, which is once you've sort of agreed and published that COVID-19 risk assessment report and circulate it amongst your employees, if you then have a particular employee who, for a valid reason, objects, then you'd obviously have to have a separate conversation with him or her individually. And for that reason, I think it's quite important that it's good to have put in place some measures to consult, because hopefully that will reassure your employees that you're taking things seriously, that you've taken into consideration their points of view, any particular practical suggestions they may have about making the workplace safer, and hopefully that will encourage and support buy-in in terms of a wider return.
So I think that's great, because that partially relates to a question which you can't see, but I can see on my screen, which was, is there a form of notice that needs to be given to employees before asking them to return? And I think from what you say, before you ask them to return, you must do a risk assessment and include their views in the risk assessment. And only when you've done the risk assessment, really, can you ask them to return.
Absolutely,
and then following on from that, you need to remember that the government guidance in the UK is, if you can work from home, stay home. So that if an employer is asking people to return to work, despite that guidance, they can ask it, but they need to bear in mind that in our context, there's a big possibility of employees refusing, and then you need to get into the questions of what if they refuse? What are my persuasion tools? Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that? Because that really does lead to one of those questions. Can you force people to return? Can you force people to stay away?
Well, I think in terms of the persuasion tools, Sean, it really depends what the reason they have for not wanting to come back is. There is I know perhaps some clients have taken a slightly cynical view, and their concern is that some people will just say they don't want to come back because they're quite happy being paid at home. But I think taking away that cynical view, I think obviously in that scenario there's a different conversation to be had. But if you genuinely had an employee with valid concerns, perhaps because they've got they're shielding someone at home, or that they've got a health condition themselves, and so they are anxious genuinely, and they've got a valid reason for doing that, then I think you would have to have quite a difficult conversation with them around what reasonable adjustments could be taken to support them to return, if that's an option, and if not, then what can they remain working at home? Is that an option too? And so it really does depend, I think, on the circumstances in terms of that they've articulated to justify their refusal, in terms of the steps that you take and the measures that you would take on, and that will vary on a case by case basis. But I guess you can't simply force people to come back.
Yeah, and very briefly on that, I'll sort of step out of the compare chair and into the answer chair as well. If you're protecting a mother or a child who has a serious health condition, we have laws in the UK to protect people with disabilities. And that doesn't only include a worker who is disabled, but their family. So there could be a disability discrimination claim if the reason for not returning is to protect their family. Also, we have laws that say if somebody refuses to work because they have a genuine concern about serious danger, and that's danger to themselves or to anybody else, including their family or their colleagues, and they walk out of the job, then if you just fire them for that, then they can have a claim for unfair dismissal with unlimited compensation. So there are some big sticks for employers to be beaten with if they try to be too aggressive in their persuasion approach. And in the UK, at least, they might need to think about lesser sanctions like keep them but don't pay them, or just pay them sick pay. I think that's maybe a very UK-specific consideration from the questions I'm getting. Just coming back to answer another question about this process of forcing return to work. I've been asked, do we need to do a risk assessment if we have fewer than employees? Do you want to answer that one?
Sorry, what was the question?
Do we need to do a risk assessment if we have fewer than employees? Is it a nice to have or is it mandatory?
Oh, it's the risk assessment is mandatory. There's I think there is a and I think you'd need to do that because of the obviously the health and safety obligations that you need to comply with. I think it would be quite foolhardy not to do that.
Right.
There is.
I've just got a related question.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So you go on.
All right.
Related question.
Yeah, there's a ton of questions coming in. There's a related question about is there a standardized risk assessment approach? And again, at the end of the slides, there's a link here to some Taylor Wessing resources where we link you through to the UK Health Executive Risk Assessment Guide. We also have a form which we've developed, and if anybody would be interested to discuss getting hold of that form, we would like to charge a small amount for it, but we've got a standardized risk assessment format for travel to work, workplace organization. So if anybody wants to have a look at that tool and discuss it with us after the call, then please get in touch on that point. Let's just go forward a little bit to working from home as an option and talk a little bit more about if you think that people are not productive away from work, can you make them come back? I think we've covered part of it with Helen's answers, which are really to do with the health and safety answer in the UK. You need to have a good override for people to come back, and remember that if they get ill, they will have a good claim against you, as well as various answers that they may be able to create around the health of their family or their own serious concerns for work. So you may ask people to return, but you may not be able to require it. And that might force you to being more positively minded to working from home. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to look at this picture here. I'm going to breach health and safety data protection rules by saying this is Rose's office at home. And look how incredibly well organized it is, with a proper expensive chair, a good screen, a proper keyboard.
The chair is from the office. I took it. Actually.
Oh, you took it?
Yeah, I took it because I don't have a proper chair at home, so I took it from the office. So.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because we've indicated that it can be hard to force people to return to work, certainly in France, certainly in the UK. What about the other side of it? What about the adjustments that you see employers making to support home working?
Well, it's very important to pay attention to the workplace at home now that so many people work from home nowadays. You need to do an assessment, especially with regards to displays and chairs, but of course it's a little bit difficult because an employer is not visiting everybody's home. So it's important to give your employees an instruction on what's important to create some kind of checklists which they could use to assess whether their workplace is appropriate. And you should also support your employees if they need any other materials or to being able to work from home in a good way. And besides that, it's important to pay attention to mental health because obviously employees don't see their managers nowadays anymore, and it's important to pay attention whether they get enough rest as well, and how how they're doing, also because they don't have any social moments and meetings anymore, if they're still happy, actually.
Well, there's a real increase in mental health support awareness issues, but do you think these, flipping it on its head, if it's hard for me to make someone come back, and maybe I can stop paying them, but I can't fire them, can an employee make me buy them stuff? If Taylor Wessing didn't let you steal the chair, could you make Taylor Wessing pay for the chair?
Yes. So this was a very cheap solution, but yes, you could. An employee could force in the Netherlands could force their employer to facilitate these materials. Definitely.
Okay, I'm going to show you now a comparison with Rose's office. This is my office, and this is literally. Well, I don't know. This is literally the view I have right now, and there's my laptop on a pile of 7 books. Don't look too closely because you can see what my hobbies are. They probably make me look like a crazy guy. But as a result of using this system, I've got pain in my right wrist and right elbow. And I think it's some kind of repetitive strain injury from using the mouse and trying to type badly. So I probably can't sue myself, but it illustrates the point that I've been away from work for 11 weeks, and maybe I'm going to be away from the office for another 11 weeks. Who knows? And in that time, I have every chance to develop some kind of health issue, mental and physical. So probably after this call, I'm going to expect an email from somebody in our HR team to say, "Are you okay?" And that lets me ask, what about remote monitoring, and what about other obligations to provide equipment? Let me get a comment on equipment from Dubai, and then I'm going to ask Tiffaine again and Michael about their feelings on monitoring people remotely, the data protection issues, and how you go about it as an employer. So firstly, AXA, and then Tiffaine and Michael.
Thank you, Sean. So from a Dubai perspective, the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization has actually issued certain guidelines for working from home, including a specific resolution which forms part of the law. And what the guidelines state is that if you are going to have employees work from home, you must facilitate this for them by providing them with a certain equipment. So personally, I've also been able to bring home my chair from the office, my monitor, my keyboard, my mouse. So I've got all my equipment, and I've got my working from home desk set up. And that's very important that employers do provide this. Now, in practice, we have seen that just by speaking to a few people in the market, that some people have not been able to provide such equipment and have asked the employees to purchase their own, which only as a gesture of goodwill, the employers have said, okay, we will reimburse you for this. But we're finding some employers are following the guidelines quite strictly and others are not. But unfortunately, no penalties are specified for not following the guidelines. But this is the point on, obviously, if you're going to have employees work from home, then you must provide them with the relevant equipment to do so.
All right, and then coming back to not just supporting them, but monitoring them, Tiffaine, Michael, have you got any comments?
Yes. So in France, just as a reminder, French employees are supposed to follow the usual working hours and to work during this usual working hours. So it seems crazy, but it is. So companies are able, in fact, to monitor the employees' work remotely in France. It means that they are not able, for example, to hear to hear their phone calls, but they can, for example, check the number of emails sent and received during the days. They could also check when employees log in and log out from their computers. So there are some ways in order to control whether the employees are actually working and when they are actually working, which is quite important because we have a lot of short-time work in France. So it's really important to ensure that employees are not working during this short-time work, and on the contrary, of course, that they are working when they are supposed to work.
Yeah, same from Germany. I think it's almost the same scenario. We have, of course, to monitor employees with regard to working time. In a certain way, we have to document working time for employees. This is a mandatory law and also judged by the European Court, as you may remember. One crucial issue is, of course, confidentiality and ensuring that the technical equipment is sufficient so that there's not a data breach by home office. And this requires, in particular, technical measures, but also clear contractual regulations, be it a work from home agreement or a works council agreement with regard to all those issues. This is definitely necessary, and from a pragmatic viewpoint, some companies don't have at the moment. So we think this should be done at least quite urgently.
So on the one hand, in Germany, you're seeing companies fighting to get back to normal, but you're also having to prepare for a different kind of future workplace, including working from home and away from the normal workplace.
This is true. So, as you can see, there's some tendency for new legislation in Germany. Of course, we have at the moment the working place standards for coronavirus. So they are mandatory and they have to be respected. And there's a big discussion about working from home as an entitlement. At the moment, Germany, we don't have an entitlement in Germany for working at home. So this is based on voluntary agreements. It may be required for vulnerable employees that they can do their jobs from home, and this is certainly something we have to discuss in future.
Helen, have you got any comments around the near future after the crisis is over and what working from home might look like?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because in the UK, we've had for some time now the right to sort of request or make arrangements to work sort of flexibly, etc. And as part of that, employees could ask to work from home. One of the proposals that is currently being discussed with the Business Secretary is that we may be looking to change our legislative framework so that employers could only in the future reject a request to work from home if they can demonstrate that the work that they're doing can only be done in the workplace. And the clear justification behind that is that what's been said is that there's a business need to reduce the demand on public transport, which of course there is, and also the cost for employers in changing the business and meeting these steps that we've been discussing in relation to the COVID-19 risk assessments. So it'd be quite interesting to see if that is implemented. But I think more generally, there is a lot of debate about, will this be the end to the big office? I think Jeff Staley, the CEO of Barclays in London, has come out quite publicly to say, Barclays will not be going back to the working arrangements that they had previously. Twitter, Google, a lot of other large employers have also been publicly coming out now to say that, this working from home arrangements are much more likely to be permanent, and it could have a massive impact on the way that we work generally, which is interesting because obviously for years women have been, not just women, but those with caring responsibilities have been fighting for better flexibility. It was interesting that potentially this pandemic has resulted in something that people have been fighting for some time.
Nature finds a way, maybe. Listen, it's 1 minute until I'm going to need to close you guys down, but I don't feel guilty about that because we've been taking So many questions live on the screen, which is a great sign of engagement. And if there are any further questions that our audience have that we haven't covered today, please do drop us an email. Our contact details are in the last slides. I'm just including through some of the things that we have touched on here as to the reasons why you need to take care to support home working arrangements and some of the difficulties with forcing people back. There are certainly a lot of conversations occurring where that is attempting to happen, and we're happy to advise on that. But just in order to let me wrap up, there's a short slide there on some practical guidance. Are people working successfully, and do you really need to have them come back to the workplace? And I think that is the central question for many businesses now. Do you really need it? And do you or don't you care about whether your employees want it? And then very quickly and lastly, I'm just going to show, or let Michael show you, a typical step plan slide for things to consider. So lastly, over to you, Michael.
Yeah, very briefly. So it's of course always necessary to have a structured proceeding how to restart the business. So the first phase is preparing the restart, then seeing that all the legal framework, the personal framework is working. And if we then start the business, we have always to be aware that there could be a phase 2 virus infection, so we can have another lockdown. And this should be reflected in our legal framework. And of course, as soon as the economy recovers, we will have to talk about work from home, salary adjustment, very important issues like short-time work management or further adjustment like holiday vacation planning we briefly discussed. And as soon as the operation is completely working, we will also have to see whether we have our lesson learned, whether we have emergency plans, risk assessment, instructions for employees in future to avoid such a surprising event we recently had in March or even earlier in all the jurisdictions. So this is definitely we recommend, and if you need some materials, so I hand over to you, Sean, then we are very happy to assist you in this respect.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all our presenters. And I think Michael summed it up very well there. Really, the crisis will be over, but the echoes of the crisis and the long-term impacts on human behavior and some of the trends that we were already seeing about technology, about homework, about democracy at work, about autonomy, those trends are going to be magnified and accelerated. So I'm sure you can look out for more events where we discuss those features and the continuing reactions to events. And you can certainly look out to us making available, we will email all registrants the slides that we have used today. And as I said, they do contain links to some materials that are easy to access. Contact us if you'd like to talk about risk assessments as well. And if you have any questions for any of the panelists in our countries represented today or any of the other countries where Taylor Wessing is present, please email us and we will be back in touch with you. Thank you all very much.